Thank you, Chairman. I would like to ask you, Mr. Koppel, based on the book that you wrote, Lights Out, what are the top 3 takeaways you want us to have today in terms of the action that we could take as a priority?
Turn your mic.
Thank you. Yes. I don't have as much familiarity with microphones as you do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question, Senator. I think you're exactly right. We're focusing a little bit on the wrong issues. And I think the key issue we need to focus on is even some of the most potentially successful measures that the industry is taking to defend itself. I think Mr. Aronson will concede are still some time off in terms of their real effectiveness. The CRISP program that he referred to before, when Mr. Aronson and I spoke about a year ago, I believe he told me that the goal was that by the end of 2015, that something like 0.4% of the industry would be covered. And I'd like to give him an immediate opportunity to respond. Maybe you're way ahead of that by now.
It is 0.4% of the number of electric utilities covering approximately 75% of all customers.
Okay, but it's still a minuscule percentage.
It's the right ones.
Okay, except that the right ones and the wrong ones are all connected.
So to that point, and it's an important one, socializing the information. CRISP is wonderful for the companies that deploy it because they get near real-time feedback about the impacts on their system. Shortly after, that information goes to classified databases, is compared to those databases, and then is actually socialized through our electric infrastructure, EISAC, Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center, to all of those 3,200 entities that you referenced. So the few who are deploying this technology are helping the whole.
Except that the deployment of that information in the age of the internet, where we're talking about fractions of a second.
With very quick development of
with
new
very
technology.
quick development, yeah. Exactly, is somewhat less than useful. My point is, I think we may be focusing on the wrong area at this moment. I think we have to conclude, whether it is from EMP, whether it is from some space weather incident, or whether it is from a cyber attack, that the United States needs to begin preparing for the consequences of a successful cyber attack on the grid in particular, because the grid indeed just does have such an impact on so many other parts of the infrastructure. We don't have enough food. We are focused primarily on MREs, meals ready to eat, which, because they only have a lifespan, a shelf span of 5 years, the government has not bought in sufficient quantity because it doesn't want to be sitting there with millions of MREs which are going to be no good after 5 years. Even if we turn to freeze-dried food, which I think is going to be the long-range answer, and if we were to begin today to try to accumulate the necessary amounts of freeze-dried food, it would be 2 to 3 years if we started right now before we had an adequate supply. We do not yet have adequate plans for evacuating, if that indeed is what has to happen. Let's say a major city like New York is hit, and a large part of the East Coast is without electric power. And some people, and we're talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of people, decide to evacuate. Where are they going to go? And I think it's a question that perhaps General Dunbar can address, the degree to which each state is prepared to accept large numbers of internal refugees. I think we need to begin making plans. I think we need to begin communicating state to state, federal government to state government, and vice versa. I know of at least one state on the East Coast whose preparations are that they would activate the National Guard, they would have their sheriff's department, they would have their state police standing there with maps, a bottle of water, and a sandwich, And as refugees from nearby cities came through, they would give them the water, the food, and the map, and show them where the nearest way out of town is.
Wow.
We assume, because we're all Americans, that every state is going to welcome vast numbers of internal refugees. I would suggest to this distinguished panel that that is not necessarily the case.
Thank you, Mr. Koppel. Mr. Aronson, I wanted to follow up. When I hear 0.4% of those that cover 75% of the infrastructure, I guess I have to agree with Mr. Koppel in terms of describing that as a very small, if not minuscule amount. But here's a question I have for you. What's your association's position on the installation of devices that would protect transformers that may be susceptible to damage from solar storms or EMP attacks?
So there is a lot of misinformation about there that there is a particular technology that would protect everything from everything. Early on, we were discussing EMP, and there are very different natures of an electromagnetic pulse. You have a high-altitude nuclear weapon is one source.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you opposing installing
No, certainly not.
devices to
Certainly
protect
not. And in fact,
transformers?
we are doing it, though, in a responsible way. Our real concern here is unintended consequences.
What kind of unintended consequences?
Potential impact to the grid. When you put new widgets, whatever they may be, blockers, capacitors, resistors on the grid, energy has to go someplace. And to Mr. Koppel's point, I will agree completely that it is a balanced system, and new stuff can throw that balance.
But here's our problem. So we're worried about new stuff, but we're facing a potential blackout situation that could cause mass chaos in our country. So as we look at the risks we're facing versus deploying new technology, and obviously there are always new undertakings with new technology, wouldn't you agree with me that this is a very important issue for industry to step up and address?
100%, and in fact, we are. There's a lot of money right now behind the Electric Power Research Institute, which is looking at just this. What would the threat be from the various kinds of EMP, whether it's a direct energy weapon, a nuclear weapon, or a geomagnetic disturbance? And what are the appropriate mitigation strategies so that we do not have those unintended consequences? We agree this is one of the risks, and we need to mitigate against it. But we don't want the solution to be worse than worse than the threat.
I'm not sure what could be worse than a blackout where we're handing people a sandwich and a bottle of water and giving them a map.
Well, let's be clear with especially. Let me break down each of the threats. If you're looking at geomagnetic disturbance, this is something that already happens all the time, and that, in fact, we do have standards in place to deal with.
Excuse me, not at a massive level. Let's be clear, not at a massive level like a Carrington effect.
The geomagnetic disturbance standard is ambivalent to whether it is a Carrington event or just your typical solar max that we get every 11 years. It is operational procedures to protect the grid in the event of a coronal mass ejection. If you then look at direct energy weapons, these are things that are mostly localized in impact, not all that different from throwing a Molotov cocktail or a bomb into a substation. It is bad, but with 45,000 substations, we have a significant amount of redundancy. The last one, looking at a high-altitude nuclear weapon, this is absolutely something that could happen, but I would posit it is a high-impact but exceedingly low probability event. This is not happening tomorrow. So let's do the right thing to ensure that as we work to mitigate against this and many other threats, that we're doing so in a risk-based and responsible way.
With all respect, I think that government has a really important issue on the a role when it comes to thinking about a nuclear attack. But let's just be clear. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, and we have Iran testing ballistic missiles right now. We have North Korea testing ballistic missiles. So we have a role in this. I get it in terms of this, but what concerns me is that that's not the only source for a potential EMP attack in terms of what could have an impact on this grid. And so what I would like to see is making sure that industry steps up. And my time is up, but I have a follow-up question, so perhaps I'll wait.
Because I want a quick follow-up. How do you explain 8 years after the 2008 EMP Commission, the GAO reports to this committee. We've done none of these, performed any of these recommendations.
So-
is GAO just wrong, or is
No, Chairman, I appreciate you actually running through the litany of the '08 report and sort of took notes as you were doing it. My understanding is the GAO report was looking at some of the things that government may or may not have been doing over the course of the last 8 years. I can say, and this goes to Senator Ayotte as well, with respect to understanding the threat and what it might do to the grid, understanding the mitigation and the appropriate way to protect should an event like that happen. The industry is well underway in not just investigating, but in some cases investing in mitigation. As companies build new control centers, as companies are building new substations and new control housing, they are doing things to shield against EMP. I note that we talked about restoration and replacement of equipment. That is something the spare transformer equipment program started in 2006, but has evolved dramatically with an eye toward any number of existential threats, whether it is combined cyber-physical attacks, really, really big storms, solar flares, or even EMP. Going down the line, looking at critical interdependencies, there is a lot of work happening in this space that mirrors the recommendations of the EMP Commission's report.
Okay, and again, I'll reiterate my request to get that information on those replacement transformers. Senator Heidkamp.
Kelly can finish.
Thanks. I just have a follow-up question. As I understand it, DOD has developed some technologies that the utilities could actually use hardware devices to protect electricity generators and pipeline compressor motors from certain cyber attacks. And I wanted to ask you, has the industry installed those hardware devices using some of the developments from the Department of Defense? And if not, why not?
So I'm not familiar with the specific devices that you're referring to, but I will say this, an enormous part of what the Sector Coordinating Council that I'm privileged to serve as part of the Secretariat for is looking at is technology transfer from the government to the industry. I will also say, as Congress, you pointed out in your question before, that this is something that government can help with as well. The Department of Defense in particular has had to contemplate how they would prosecute a nuclear war and has some really interesting information about what the impact of a high-altitude nuclear weapon might look like to the grid. The more we can do to get that information into the hands of the folks who are doing this research to apply it to the grid would be invaluable.
So I'm going to submit for the record a follow-up question, because as I understand, you have the information and you have the ability to do this. And so I'll ask a very specific question and follow up for the record on this to get a more specific answer from you. And I would like to thank all of our witnesses for being here, and the chairman. Thank you.